Hi everyone, thank you for joining us online today for Friday Focus. For those of you that are maybe not familiar with this format or haven't joined one of these talks before, Friday Focus is an online talk series that is hosted by the Hunterian, and we are the museum and art gallery at the University of Glasgow. In each edition of these talks, we'll hear from a different speaker covering a different topic. And we tend to look at our exhibitions and displays that are happening across our venues, as well as research that goes on here at the Hunterian and across the University of Glasgow, and all the exciting work that goes on behind the scenes with our collections. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Robyne Calvert, who's going to deliver a talk today about artistic dress and the connections with the Glasgow style. Robyne Calvert is the Effective Learning Advisor at the College of Arts and Humanities here at the University of Glasgow. She's a cultural historian who is focused on material culture of the long 19th century. She's lectured here at the University of Glasgow as well as the Glasgow School of Art and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. So Robin's going to give us a bit of a presentation today, and then there'll be some time at the end for any questions that you might have. And you can pop your questions in the chat by clicking on the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll read those out for you at the very end. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us online today, and I'll hand over to Robyne now to deliver this week's talk.
Great. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thanks for coming along. I think it's a nice rainy day activity, and it's nice to see some familiar people also in the audience. Hello to you, friends. So yes, I am going to do a very rapid talk on something today that is very close to my heart, artistic dress, and particularly in relation to the Glasgow style, and pointing to some things that have connections to this in the Hunterian collections. Now, I should say this was the subject of my PhD. It's something I've talked about loads. So doing something in 20 minutes is really quite a feat for me, but I'm going to press on. And so some things I will be delivering very rapidly. And but I can tell you that there's more information out there in other talks on the internet, but also you can contact me if you want to know more about any of these things. I'm just going to hide myself so I don't have to see me anymore. Right. So I came to this research really, I often say because of the Mackintoshes, but let's be honest, it's Margaret. I actually moved to Glasgow 20 years ago to research particularly Margaret MacDonald McIntosh's work, but I ended up getting into her husband's work as well. But I'll be less focused on him today, although he is important. But you can see in these photographs that Margaret has quite a particular way of dressing. And if you know anything about Victorian clothing, you might, or even this is more Edwardian, getting more towards Edwardian, it might look a little bit different to you. If you don't, that's okay. I'm going to show you some pictures in just a minute. But I noticed that it was quite unusual. And actually, to be honest with you, I kind of wanted to wear what she was wearing. I just thought it was great stuff, from the kind of puffy sleeves that she had, the ruffled flounces, to the really fantastic jewelry that obviously was designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh and other friends of hers. But I kept sort of reading sort of vague things about how she probably made these clothes herself. And then looking a little more widely at the four, I knew that this dress was made by, well, ultimately, I knew that this dress was made by Frances Macdonald, her sister. She made this dress for herself, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. And then even the way in which Mackintosh and McNair are dressed here with this big floppy bow tie, it was pointed out, or it had been said, that this was meant to represent their artisticness. And I can compare it here for you with, this is very much generic menswear circa 19th, early 20th century. Now, I am being very broad and generic because this is a short talk, so please forgive me. If there's any actual Victorian experts, I know there's at least one person in the audience might wag their finger, but I'm giving you a very broad brushstroke that menswear was thought to be fairly staid, fairly straightforward. And of course, the stovepipe hat was more of a 19th century thing. But this is just to show you that this wearing of these sort of floppy bow ties by McNair and Mackintosh were meant to signify their artisticness. And these are portraits that they had made. These would not be, for example, their professional architect portraits that they would have. So I became really interested in this. I'm like, wow, these people are dressing kind of different. I'm curious about that. And when you have a kind of question that you get curious about, sometimes it turns into an entire great subject for a PhD. And that's basically what I did. But in order to kind of understand how this was different, of course, I had to look back at fashion history to see what people were actually wearing, and then maybe where some of these ideas of artistic dressing came about. So you're going to, again, have to bear with me. You're just going to have to take what I'm saying as truth, that it starts with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. But it starts in a kind of murky way. And I kept seeing things. Part of the thing that made this a great question was that this subject was really talked about in sort of confused and conflicting manners. And it was talked about kind of in art historical texts as well. So not necessarily fashion histories. Anyway, it just seemed a bit muddy and needed a bit of sorting out, which is what I ended up being able to do. It does start with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I'm showing you the three heavy hitters of it right here: Millais, Rossetti, and Hunt. They weren't alone, though. Rossetti's brother, William Michael, was an important sort of documenter of the movement. And then later on, we get their pals, Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris, joining in. And there were others too, but again, in the interest of time, I'm focusing on these guys. And you can see from the photos, in some ways, they might be wearing, Rossetti's actually a little bit boring here in what he's wearing, actually. Hunt's got this nice kind of jaunty cap. Rossetti. Hunt is wearing actual dress from the Holy Land when he went and toured there. And you can see there's some velvet coat action going on with these guys. And you might even notice Millais is wearing what is called a papillon, which is a French early sort of artistic tie. So this is our precursor to the floppy tie. So they were interested in dress, but mostly they were interested in dress and dress history for the purpose of the paintings they were making. So for example, Millais' Ophelia, where the model here is Elizabeth Siddal, she actually did model in what Millais called an antique dress that he found. We don't exactly know what antique means, but they're looking around. They're looking in sort of what we might call vintage clothing trade places at the time, looking for things for them to model in. They also design it itself. So I'm going to switch mostly to women now. That was your little moment of what it's like for men, but I'm going to talk mostly about women the rest of the time now. This is just a little, here's what Victorian clothes look like for women. Again, really super general slide, but just as a reminder, we go from these really wide crinoline and hooped skirts and more cinched looking waists and big bell sleeves to, of course, the evolution of the bustle and the bustle pad and what it looked like later in the century. So this is just to give you, again, a sense of that outline. But here is how the Pre-Raphaelites are painting the women that, or the clothing that they're interested in, mostly worn by women. And very specifically, I like to pull these three paintings out when I talk about this subject because this dress was designed by Millais. His mother made it up for him. This dress worn by Ellen Terry in Watts's painting Choosing was actually designed by William Holman Hunt. And this dress, which Rossetti borrowed from, was made by Jane Morris. He borrowed it from Jane Morris, and you can see all of them are kind of looking back to the past. They're looking back to a romanticized version of the past, of whether it's medieval or Renaissance with this kind of ruched. They're sort of creating these, you know, updated imaginings of what the past looked like and what they thought was beautiful for the purposes of the paintings that they're making. It is, dare I say, a little bit of cosplay for the purposes of modeling costume. Now, just to look behind the curtain, though, if you will, this is the only weird transition slide, but I think it's a fun one. If we were to look at the actual women themselves, here is Jane Morris on the left. Here is Elizabeth Siddal on the right. This slide is slightly tongue-in-cheek if you know anything about their history of Rossetti caught between these two women, because he very much was, but that's a different lecture. But you can see in these photographs, particularly the one of Siddal on the right, she is actually wearing a dress with a crinoline and hoops and that wide bell sleeve, just like some of the fashion plates I showed you. In fact, Jane Morris's dress is also one of those dresses, but for the purpose of the photograph that she's modeling in, and Rossetti goes on to use these photographs as source material for paintings he makes. She's just simply wearing a typical dress without the crinoline, without the hoops, draped over the arm of the chair. She's turned back the sleeves. And I say she because I think she very much had agency in how she was modeled and how she was sort of styling up this dress for the purpose of these photographs. Okay, so I'm pointing out all of these things because the early days of what is artistic dress is a very, very muddy area. And what I kind of sort of talk about in my research is that really a lot of this stuff was made for the purposes of paintings and modeling costume, but then it starts to influence how people are dressing out into the world a bit more. And the early stages of it is just kind of how they're styling up their regular clothes, and then the actual garments start to change and become a little bit different. So this is the definition. I'm not going to read it out in full, but this is literally kind of my PhD in a nutshell of what artistic dress is. It was a style through which certain individuals in artistic circles, such as artists, architects, etc., communicated their identification with aesthetic life, ideals, and philosophies that we might call counterculture today. They run against the mainstream. So they're expressing their artisticness. And this is a picture from the 1880s, 1886 to be precise, of May Morris, William and Jane's daughter, who was a great designer herself. And you can see how the clothing starts to become very, very different in the silhouette than the kind of bustle that was very popular at the time. Okay. One more image to show you, actually just two more things for the historical context, and then we're moving to Glasgow. One is just to note that by the 1880s, there was lots of debate and talk about this in magazines and in the press. This wasn't just some weird thing that if a few artists were doing, but it was actually influencing sort of fashion trends in the Victorian period. So the Queen magazine noted in 1881 that among the records of fashion, one of the most noteworthy is the way in which apparel, variously termed pre-Raphaelite, artistic, high art, or aesthetic, has become a recognized factor in the dress of English women. So that was interesting for me looking at this topic because even in the 1880s, they were calling it all these different kinds of things. But this painting I'm showing you, famous painting by Frith, A Private View at the Royal Academy, shows the difference between here's a very high fashion dress of that period at center, and then these are aesthetic dresses that have the sort of bolder colors in the more natural garments. This wonderful peach sort of colored dress here that has the long watteau pleat and a long train with fabric looped up. These dresses would have looked weird to everybody else in the room, even though they might not look so strange to us now. And just to point out, that's Oscar Wilde right there, if you don't know. So he's at the center of aestheticism. So all of this is a bit of a cult of celebrity that's happening at the time as well. The last little bit of historical context I want to give you is that, again, this is being written about, and it's also being written about like in style manuals, if you will. So we might call Mrs. Hawes, Mary Eliota Hawes, writing in 1883, I'm going to cringe saying this, she was kind of an influencer. Okay, she was an influencer of her day. And she writes this, one of my favorite passages from all of these sort of advice guides. A dress, whether in life or on canvas, in order to be considered a beautiful one, must be regarded in two lights. First, in its relation to the wearer, and second, in its relation to the surroundings. You must not buy dresses which in fashion or color are unsuitable for your room, and you must not have rooms, that are unsuitable for your dress. Actually, that move is fine because it is exactly what I'm moving to, but I am just going to go back here for a second because I had to throw some Whistler in because we have a huge collection of Whistler, of course, here at Glasgow. I was very lucky to work with it too. And Whistler is very much part of this aestheticism, which thinks about these sort of interior spaces. He constructs these fantasies of spaces, and Symphony in Flesh, Color, and Pink, Portrait of Mrs. Frances Leland is a really amazing example of this, in which he did, in fact, design the dress that she wore to be painted in. Now, the paintings that we have on display in the Hunterian at the moment are later works. Some of them are unfinished, but I think you can still go and see the way in which Whistler was interested in like the interiority and the dress. Even you can see it even in his etchings and watercolors. But moving to spaces you can see, I really wanted to just touch on this for a moment, that this idea of what we call the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, where we talk about interiors where they're, everything is designed as a holistic thought, everything is thought through, everything is designed as this unified whole, did actually also translate to the way you dress. So here you're seeing the reconstructed interior of the Mackintosh house here at the Hunterian. And here is back to our wonderful Margaret MacDonald. Now, these photographs were taken in their home. It was actually, I think these were actually taken in their flat at Main Street, but the interiors are very similar. They were carried over when they moved to their own house in 1906. So these are about circa like 1900, 1902, just after they married in 1900. So, thinking about the way in which Margaret is actually dressing in a way that complements the interior that she's in, does help us to think about their relationship as well as working artistic partners. And I've left this little quote in here I quite love. Tashi and Margaret, they were very close indeed. You never saw one without the other. They always did absolutely everything together, hand in glove throughout their lives. Which is really interesting to think about, maybe the way in which they might have influenced the way each other dressed a little bit too. Um, we don't know, unfortunately, we don't know much about their relationship in its early days. There's a lot of rumors and hearsay. We do know by the time these photographs were taken in 1893, they were part of this group of friends at the Glasgow School of Art. But for my research in this particular, I talk about these photographs in so many different contexts because I just love them. For this subject, the important thing to note is on the far right, that's Margaret MacDonald. See how her waist is cinched in this photograph? She is definitely wearing a corset, okay? She and you can see the other women, her friends from Glasgow School of Art, and all the names are listed there, are maybe not dressing in the same kind of fashionable corset that she is. As a reminder, or those who don't know, Margaret and Frances were actually English, born and raised, and they moved up to Glasgow in the late 1880s. Um, I'm not saying this is particularly English or anything, although it was commented that she did have a particularly English style of dress somewhere kind of early days. But what we don't know what that means. We don't know what it means. Is it? I think it means fashionable, quite frankly. But she's very fashionable in this photograph, and it's very different than the kind of things we saw in the previous photograph. So I've got to just fire through these. I'm mindful of time here, but just to show you, these are just a couple different angles. You can see her waist here, and these are more at a natural waist, which is something that artistic dress was interested in. Clothes that hung naturally, clothes that were fitted to the natural form of the body and not cinched in. Like this is a wonderful shot here, you can see. So what influences then these ideas to kind of change? Well, one of the things that does come in, and this is something that all of the artists from the 19th century that I look at in my research are interested in, is fancy dress, whether dressing up for paintings or dressing up for masks. So here's Margaret dressed for a particular mask. She's supposed to be wearing sort of Celtic robes here and her hair done up. And then this is Frances Newbury and Jessie Newbury, again, dressed for a mask. And Newbury wrote masks for the art school. And then these are sketches of costumes for the mask done by Dorothy Carlton Smith. So here's again Jessie Newbury. She's incredibly important. So one thing to point to for artistic dress in Glasgow is that a lot of the wonderful Glasgow style embroidery factors into what we might consider. And so this is the kind of very end of artistic dress as a movement, but also the culmination and where it meets up with things that are happening in the continent, as you'll see in just a minute. But so here's these wonderful collars that Jessie Newbury designed, which now we have in Glasgow museums, but the relationship with other embroidery, children's dresses that she designed. Here's her wearing her own. Gosh, I wish we still had this wonderful sort of cloak that she's got on here. And then this again was disseminated amongst friends in Europe. So this is a little book that is in the Hunterian collection. It's Animutasius das Eigenkleiderfrau, which means a woman's own clothing. So the clothing a woman makes for herself. Here's some of those dresses designed by Jessie Newbury, photographed in them. Here very quickly is Animutasius herself, who was interested in this, and it was called Künstlerkleid she's from Austria, and in Germany it's art dress, Künstlerkleid. And then here are those photographs, which are in this book. This, in fact, this dress, which is lost to time and I wish we had, is actually, um, made by Frances Macdonald and reproduced in this book. That's the only place we have it. In fact, that's why all the pictures of it are real pixely and weird. But it's got these huge rosettes on it, the same kind of things you see in Glasgow style artwork, these trailing, beautiful draping beadwork, this large kind of decorative thing at her decolletage. Oh gosh, I wish we had this dress. And you can see it's got that same kind of train that you saw in the painting by Frith. So, um, this overlap and influence of artistic dress, this is the thing, it's part of that larger body of work. So obviously there's kind of textile work that you see even in like curtains for a settee, but it shows up even in like watercolors and in the theme of it, like this, like the work of sewing and hand making and embroidery is a language that comes into the art. So I love this piece. Frances Macdonald McNair's, the title is Man Makes the Beads of Life, but Woman Must Thread Them. So it's obviously a, metaphor for procreation, sexual activity, all of that, which are themes that they're very interested in, but it's being rendered in the language of sewing. And again, just it plays out in their interior work. And I'm just showing you also here, this is the Rose Boudoir, both of those rooms were made for the Turin International Exhibition of Art. But to bring into things you can see here in Glasgow, the wonderful gesso panel, which I've talked about in a million other talks that are out in the world. But I just popped in the other day to get these close-ups of the same kinds of beads that you find in their sewing kit are found in the surface of the gesso panels by Margaret as well. So there's this real influence across materials and materiality. So this is just to mention the very important Ann Macbeth, who follows in the footsteps of Jessie Newbury at the Glasgow School of Art in establishing embroidery as a really important field of production, and she writes lots about it. And then one of her students, Daisy McGlashan, makes this incredible dress, which is still in the collection at Glasgow School of Art. Now, I'm pulling this in because you might have noticed I've not shown you very many actual garments still in real life, and that's because there's not that many that still exist. Unfortunately, everything's being studied from paintings and photographs and everything, but we can kind of get the sense of the things that they were making. Like the colors here are very much suffrage colors. This dress is wonderful. It even has a secret little pocket in the skirt we love to look at. What colors was Margaret using? I think very similar ones. One of the wonderful things we do have here in the Hunterian is the contents of her sewing box, which give us some of the kinds of colors of things that she may have been using, possibly likely for the kinds of soft furnishings she was making, but equally possibly for some of her clothing. And this is a wonderful kind of later watercolor of her by Olive Carleton Smith. And so this kind of gives us sort of the information to piece things together. And the last thing I'll say about Glasgow style particularly is it's a kind of DIY that anybody can do. And the work that Ann Macbeth was doing in like her educational needlework and the sort of educational programs she was promoting was that anybody can go out and take their stuff and make it more beautiful. And this is one of the things I like in a contemporary sense where we're coming back to ideas of make, do, and mend for sustainability and that we think about maybe we can do things to our clothes. So I actually finally, as a piece of research, learned to do a little bit of embroidery. I made some very shugly attempts at being a Jessie Newbury or an Ann Macbeth and made a collar that is attached to the dress, which I learned very quickly. Now I can never watch that dress because it's beautiful silk thread, and that's why you make a detachable collar. And this is research, everyone. I got to go cosplay a little bit in the Willow Tea Room in it as part of a wider looking piece of a research network that looks at remaking as a form of practical research. And so I did what was called a Reform Dress Challenge that was out on the internet, kind of inspired by some of my research, which was quite nice. So I thought I would land on that. This is again just a really fast, so fast look into what artistic dress is, what it might have looked like in Glasgow. It really just gives you a taster, but I hope it also gives you something to think about as you go sort of look around the Hunterian and see where maybe this manifests in work that's on display and also elsewhere in Glasgow. Take yourself to Mackintosh at the Willow and sit in the Salon de Rutluxe, maybe even dress up for it. Um, and like I did, that they'll appreciate it. But anyway, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight, and I welcome any questions. I realize that was ridiculously fast.
Thank you so much, Robyne. That was amazing. And yes, a whistle-stop tour. But it's just really fascinating to think of artists cosplaying in that way, but also definitely something that you can see in contemporary dress with like artists and writers dressing a particular way, but maybe not so much like as cohesively as a group, but people do still.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. And I think that one of the things I didn't say is the reason I was interested in the first place isn't so much. And I actually, let me just say they weren't really cosplaying. I kept saying that because it makes it a bit relevant, but this is how they dressed. I mean, it was how they were dressing. And the idea of even wearing vintage clothing, Miss Cranston did that. Like, you know, she was wearing dresses 20 years out of date for at the tea rooms. So I do think that it was a very deliberate way that they were expressing their identity. And the reason I think I was super interested in this beginning is we still do that. It's totally relevant, particularly having worked at the art school, like art school kids in our campus too. I see stuff all the time that is just, you know, we express ourselves through our clothes. And that's why I think it's an interesting subject and still a relevant and important subject.
Very much so. Yeah, if anybody's got any questions, you can pop them in the chat and I will read those out for you. I was just interested actually, Robyne, if in your research you had uncovered what like why it was so deliberate that the group dressed in very similar ways. Do you think that that was something that they'd thought about to present themselves together, or is it something of like, you know, being part of a group, you emulate each other? Or
Yeah, I mean, I do just think it was another way to express the artistic aesthetic that they like. Um and they, you know, it comes their influences are aestheticism and the arts and crafts movement. So not only are they making beautiful things to look at, making beautiful things to have in your homes, but they're making beautiful things to wear. And there is a kind of deeper, slightly more philosophical side of aestheticism that says, you know, if you dress in a beautiful way, it's actually an expression of your interior state. It's like the state of your soul. So it's not as frivolous or vain, perhaps. It's more about like that kind of presentation. I mean, it's all, and it is that influence in some ways of Japan and Eastern philosophy built into that too. It's yeah, it is a more serious thing, and I think it also makes them a bit more group. It's like I said, it's the same as today in a lot of ways, the way we identify ourselves with our tribe, if you will, and in the way we in the last sort of um, I would say particularly since the pandemic, though it started slightly before, the whole "What's your aesthetic?" Like, that blew my mind. I'm like, "We're back to aestheticism," and I have started to write a little bit about that because that's not something that was said 10 years ago. So the idea that you have an aesthetic, they were doing that too.
amazing. There's a comment in the chat which just asks whether you think that artistic dress attracted negative or positive comments from others in society.
I'm gonna take a stab and say mostly negative. Like our goths walking around today, they look weird, right? These people looked weird. They look strange. But in the same way that the art of Glasgow style attracted negative comments, it was called the spook school, and like it just came out of the graveyard. I mean, put this clothing in black, and they are a bunch of goths, quite frankly, which is probably also why I like it. So I think mostly it was strange, but certainly there were people who also did find it beautiful. I think it's just, again, I hate to keep saying it's like today, but I think it is a bit more. But they were bold. They were quite bold in doing it. And I think rewinding back to a bit of earlier in my research, that's one of those things where there's a bit of mythology about there being a thing called Pre-Raphaelite dress because those paintings I showed you, like they were not running around the streets like that. That's why I pull out that Elizabeth Siddal photograph because there's this myth that she would have been like running around London like that. And 100% she wouldn't have. That would have not been acceptable in 1860. So it's a bit later where, and I think where people start transgressing it are things like gallery openings and at homes and salons. It's what I call the semi-private areas of society. So it's still a little bit like, and also those aesthetic gowns you see when you actually, there are some extant copies and you look at them, they have boning in them. So they're not even transgressing things in the sort of construction way as much as they look like on the outside, if that makes any kind of sense. So.
Amazing, thank you so much. And I think that's just about all we have time for. But just before we finished, I wanted to ask if people were to find out more about your research. I know that you spent a lot of time writing about this for your thesis, but where can people go to find out more about artistic dress?
That's a good question. You can email me. I do have a website that has lots of like posts and things about it, although it's quite out of date. You can download my thesis in our library, and everyone is after me for this to be my next book, and I really do want it to be. It's just been a matter of, you know, time and trying to take a small break from the last book, which was quite a beast. Um, so hopefully there will be a book, but I do welcome people to message me. Oh, actually, I'll make a plug too. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I am part of a network, sorry, called 19th Century Dress and Textiles Reframed. And we do free talks like the last Sunday of every month. And in fact, the next one at the end of this month is going to be with Cosprop and yeah, really great stuff. So if you message me, I can give you the info for that group also. It's a really wonderful research group.
Amazing. Thank you so much. A recording of this talk will be made available in about a week's time and will be on our YouTube channel. But I will also maybe send some of those links around to people that joined today if you would like to contact Robyne or see another talk of this kind. So thanks so much, Robyne, for today. And thank you everyone for joining us online today. And I hope you all have a lovely weekend when it comes to it.